we're back and we're continuing our conversation as to where we are in the implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Today is actually International Day Against Corruption, and it's 3 years since the signing of the UNCAC. We have with us two representatives, Senator Salas from the Belize network of NGOs, and Giacomo Sanchez representing the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Unfortunately, Mr. Mora had to leave us. He had some union duties he had to attend to. But we are continuing with the conversation, and the question I left with was looking at, while you have stated that since February of this year there's been no meeting with the project committee, and that things have slowed down in terms of the rollout. My question is, what are you doing within your own agencies to perhaps either build awareness, sensitization, or get everyone on board on working towards the execution of the UNCAC?
Yeah. So if we take it from the larger private sector standpoint, I think we need to appreciate that it's not a unilateral type of response. Yeah. Private sector just won't come along that way. And if you look at the tenets of the convention itself, it speaks directly to the government taking the lead in ensuring that there's the proper instruments that then guides how private sector will do their daily business. So to a great extent, private sector, the more mature within our economy, taking care of themselves. They're doing their audits according to international standards and all that stuff with all the required disclosures that goes along with that process. But then there's a rapid growth in medium and small business. Yeah. And those aren't accounted for. We're not seeing. So what? Think about it. If you go back to 2002, there was some movement in terms of changes to the legislation relating to the Companies Act. Companies Act guides a lot of what business does. That has been sitting there since then. And no one has ever, decided to make any changes. I mean, from a private sector standpoint, that is something, if that legislation is upgraded, then there's been some tweaks over the years, which is rather inconsequential. So where we are today, if something as basic as just a Companies Act that guides how companies in Belize operate, that would be a stone throw way of getting closer to what is expected from the private sector. So the private sector cannot be left alone to.
Well, you can't regulate yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
but you can't function with integrity.
Correct. And so a great deal of businesses are at that level, but unfortunately the expectation is that so everyone is kind of going at the same drumbeat, and that is not where we are right now.
I have heard on several occasions from senior government officials that it shouldn't only be the public sector, and what about the private sector? But as we were just discussing, we expect the government to take the lead and set the example. Yeah. And many in the private sector, and I don't think this is any justification, but they say if the government is not setting the example, then why should we? I think that's not a valid argument, but that's they cop out in a way. Right? So the government must take the lead. It is the government that legislates and that implements the laws. So they are the ones who need to put these different instruments in place.
The size of the government and the robust nature of everything that happens within that umbrella, I think, and it's just my opinion, that perhaps it would be wishful thinking to believe that you can do away with corruption altogether, particularly if you begin at the government level. Because if they can't get it right there, then how do they turn to the wider society and say, okay, these are what we need to do, these are the steps that we need to take in order to stamp out corruption?
Well, Mr. Sanchez said the right instruments need to be put in place and strengthened, and the agencies that are charged, and we need to also mention the FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, that are charged with looking after these things need to be given the proper tools and the resources. The FIU, from a couple of meetings I've had with them over the last couple of years, they estimate that they really need to look after almost 2,000 groups, organizations, and companies. That's a whole lot with the small staff that they have.
Yeah.
So they need the resources, and
not to mention,
one way. Yes, no, go ahead.
Just to complement what you're saying, that's what they might be saying, but the reality is, if you look at just the company's registry, there's in excess of 8,000 entities registered.
Wow. Yeah.
So
there you go.
in terms
That shows
of
you
a
the
regulatory
extent of the
capacity,
challenge.
I mean, they have their hands full.
But, and it's right here in the UNCAC, the aspect of illicit enrichment. If we look at that one alone, if we are serious about tackling corruption, look at that aspect of illicit enrichment. We know, the average Belizean out there knows who can afford what or who cannot afford what.
Absolutely.
We know.
Absolutely.
So it is a matter of going there and asking for records, and if you can prove it, you know, then you should be in trouble.
This is where it really goes back, and it's, you know, I know very often when people hear conversations like this, it's always thinking, oh, well, you're just jumping on the government. Well, there are leaders. A government they're representatives of us. They're the people we vote to be able to execute what will be in our best interest in this country. And if we are collectively saying, well, we're tired of corruption, then you have to do something about it. But it takes great political will.
It does. It does.
You know, you speak about what people can afford and can't afford, and I always think to myself that Belize is designated as an upper middle income country. And if we are to be honest with ourselves and we look around in our own country, who are we fooling?
Yeah.
You know, the majority of people are not living upper middle income.
But
There are
this-
very wealthy people,
Yeah.
and there are many very poor people. in
The
it.
disparity is great.
Just let's go back to the Sanchez point about the size of government and the task or the undertaking there. Do recall we have on planet Earth a few companies that are larger than the budget that the government of Belize has to manage. And they have minimized to a great extent the kind of leakages that we're experiencing as a government. Yes, the government model as a public sector entity is a little different, but nonetheless, it's no different from a major corporation that managing billions of dollars. So it is achievable in terms of minimizing, because it's an illusion to think that it will go away 100%.
Yeah.
So
We need to mention and acknowledge, Joe, Mr. Sanchez, and I know you'll agree with me, that we have good public officers.
Oh, yeah.
There are
Yeah.
people there that really are trying and want to do the right thing. So just before Mr. Nigel Hawk left, it's about a year now, no?
there was.
We were in discussion of a new slew of legislation, such as whistleblowers legislation and witness protection legislation. The discussion had started. Since his departure, nothing. But these are two examples of new laws that we need to put in place so that people who want to do the right thing and are seeing these horrible actions could report it and be protected. In a small country like Belize, with a small population, that becomes very challenging because we like to say we all know each other.
The last
But there are
whistleblower was
mechanisms that can be put in
publicly
place.
disparaged for coming forward with information that eventually kickstarted
Yeah.
an
But that's why we need the
investigation.
legislation to protect these people and for the mechanism to be put in place so that there are people in there that want to do the right thing.
Correct.
You know, gentlemen, you are involved in the execution or the rollout as a part of the project committee. From your experience, how would you gauge the will to drive this process forward? Is it personality based? Is there a general adaptation that there is a drive to, I mean, we won't become a completely corruption-free country, and it won't happen overnight. It's going to take, again, political will and some time to be able to roll out.
Yeah.
But are you getting from where you sit that this is actually something that we're taking seriously?
I'll say no, because I think something as granular as reviewing or existing legislation and the changes that is required. The changes that are indeed required are really implementing checks and balances. And I don't think our government officials, they've identified it and realized that, you know, that's too much giving up of the power that resides in their office. So that's where the difficulty is. That's why there's no buy-in. That's why we're not going anywhere quickly.
It needs to be civil society that really takes up the mantle to keep bringing that pressure, because from the government it won't happen. And I would not be surprised if there is a change in government for that same approach to be taken. Because as we've said before, to effectively tackle corruption, fight corruption, you are agreeing as leaders of this country to give up a lot of power.
Yep.
And that's one of the hardest things to do. The easiest thing is to perpetuate yourself in power.
I think if you look at any of the, currently we're going through sort of a mini silly season, and then we're going to the general election.
Oh, I was going to get there. How realistic are we being, even in sounding the alarm
But
right
at the
now?
end of the day, we can look right now, look at any of the documentation coming out of either side.
Yeah.
There is no coherent message to say this on day 1 to day 100, we want to have these achievements as it relates to corruption or any of the low-hanging fruits, because the implementation of the UNCAC is not a difficult process. And there are a few low-hanging fruits that we can
If we're describing certain things to be a matter of a lack of political will, can it then be argued that perhaps this is deliberately being drawn out so that come 2020, whoever succeeds in this particular administration will have that headache to deal with once people come forward again and clamor for it?
Look, in the whole aspect of UNCAC implementation, right, at the project board level, Mr. Sanchez, myself, and the NTUCB rep, Mr. Enriquez, we proposed for government to include in the central budget, in the national budget, some funds for UNCAC implementation. We made that proposal in writing as well. I remember debating the budget this past March. There was not one mention of UNCAC. And in the Attorney General's ministry as a focal point for UNCAC, no, I take it back. There was one mention of UNCAC in the office of the Auditor General. In the Attorney General's ministry and nowhere else in the budget document was a mention of UNCAC. So that shows you right there that the interest is not there. And we cannot keep depending on external funding to drive this implementation process forward. The first year was UNDP, and the person heading the office at the time was extremely supportive. We were very active that year. The second year, I think it was currency funding under the through the U.S. Embassy, and things slowed down. We need to drive that process. We need to put some funds.
It goes back to what we're doing.
It's also counter. I hate saying it because it's almost saying that it's okay, but very often to invest in anti-corruption legislation, it means to cut off your own feeding tube. And we have to be honest about that. I mean, if we look at this time, and Giacomo, I'm glad you mentioned it, because perhaps even with sounding this alarm today, maybe someone gets irate and starts to agitate for some action. It's very unlikely, moving into an election cycle, that we're going to see any questions about looking at contracts and where money is being fleeced. You know, if $500,000 goes into one campaign or another campaign out of a contract for a road, nobody's going to take the time now to say anything about it, because that's critical for election season. And this is like, that's a lower end estimation as to what may be coming out of some of these contracts.
Financing reform or
another important piece of legislation.
The need for us to have those regulations in place to be able to monitor how kickbacks work, or to be able to monitor how campaigns are being funded and through which medium.
So what should we do?
Well, my question was going to be, you mentioned low-hanging fruit. If there were something that we as a society can say, because we have to be realistic as to what we'll be able to achieve, what would be some of the immediate actions that even at the project committee you've identified that it just takes a little bit of action to move into implementation? What are some of the things that we're looking at? Because I know the UNCAC, and to be clear, this hasn't been rolled out in just Belize. This has been implemented in many other countries. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel or it's an insurmountable challenge.
Two things: the Public Accounts Committee that you mentioned earlier, and of course the Integrity Commission.
Exactly.
What about the Public Accounts?
And the Contractor General's Office.
Let's say like the Integrity Commission. If you look at the template that Jamaica used, they essentially took whatever the convention was guiding, and they actually put it into force. And there's where we need, because the Integrity Commission doesn't necessarily only need a secretariat support, but they also need some autonomy. And there are mechanisms and ways of achieving that. But out of political convenience, I guess, it's frowned upon, at least for now.
But having a secretariat would go a long way. I need to mention, look, our Prevention of Public Corruption Act stipulates it right there that there must be a secretariat, and the 4 or 5 key posts that there should be. For years, we've only had the actual commission, the commissioners, and 2 office support staff. So how in the world will they do their jobs to oversee all area reps, all senators, all municipal officers at the city and town councillors?
You're looking in excess, at least for elected officials in Belize, just in excess of about 1,100 people. Now that's 1,100 annual registrants who are filing their report.
Should be.
And it's not just to file.
That's
I
what I
mean,
was
you
thinking.
need an
goes
office
beyond
that actually goes in and do some
forensic
analytics.
investigation.
To analytics to make sure that something,
That this
any
Because-
unexplained wealth can be.
Exactly. How does someone offer him or herself for a public office, gets elected, and at the point where that individual was initially campaigning, everyone knows where he lives, everyone knows what's going on in terms of the job that he holds, what have you. The minute that individual becomes elected, he becomes a millionaire over the course of the 5 years, and then how does he amass that wealth?
Which is why it should go beyond filing.
Exactly.
As Kimo has said, it needs to go into investigation, forensic investigation, right? And then we'll get into exactly what's happening.
And the failure goes many ways, because perhaps we don't communicate sufficiently the amount of money that a minister should be paid. It's not that much. I mean, it's a lot for some people, but it's not enough to account for the level of wealth that we now see some elected officials having. And we have to be honest with ourselves as a society. If I am looking at my area rep and he went from, a nice home to a mansion and multiple vehicles and tons of vacations, and the minister's salary is what? I think we reported once or twice when we were talking about the absent minister from the House. But that's what they're supposed to be making?
2 years ago, we celebrated this very day, this very date, with an anti-corruption symposium, if you recall.
Correct.
And our keynote speaker was the head of Botswana's anti-corruption agency. And he laid out what they do. And in an instance like that, the example that we're referring to, they freeze your assets. They freeze it until you can demonstrate how come you have that, and legitimately have that. And they have fared in Botswana. Botswana have their own challenges too, but that's why they decided that they needed to set up an independent, fiercely independent anti-corruption entity. And we could also talk about the Electoral Commission, which in Jamaica is also independent. And so this discussion really can go into various areas. But what to do, we were talking, it's a pity Mr. Mora had to leave early, but they just came back from their annual general meeting at Kikaka just yesterday and Saturday. And he shared that one of the things they decided is that they will set up a committee within the NTUCB to develop policy statements to present to the political parties. And I shared with him that within the Belize network of NGOs, we are also thinking to do something similar to that. So we will be talking about as social partners working together to develop such statements and proposals to submit to the political parties and the public with recommendations and demands. That is part of what we can do.
In the chamber itself, we have an anti-corruption task force, but that was primarily guided so much by how much momentum we had gotten from the actual implementation, and so the work that we were doing there was more like on the advocacy side and just public sharing and all that good stuff. That had slowed because of everything just slowing down. But I think in going into 2020. There'll be a resurgence more so to engage government more, because I think that is what needs to be done. It cannot be just that we're speaking to the public and not to the public officials.
There are a lot of people who perhaps are watching this and just dismissive, that nothing's going to change, that this is going to be the way things continue.
It's not your typical Christmas subject.
No, agreed, but But one, I mean, I would argue we should be having every day
Yes.
until it
yes,
changes.
Yes, yes.
And maybe that's what we could close off with, kind of just looking at why it's important that we get this problem under control. We know it exists without pointing fingers, without having facts. There's enough for us to see, that we've heard, that we all know about personally, to know it exists, and it exists from the highest level to the
Yeah.
everyday man. But we got to start with the implementers first.
Yeah.
Fighting corruption costs. It's expensive. But it is worth every penny that we put towards it. Because then, if we look at public contracts alone as an example, we'll start to get the real bang for our money. The real bang for our money. Instead of shoddy construction and multiple repairs. That's money literally down the drain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So whereas in the short term it may cost a lot, in the medium to long term we'll start to see the fruits of fighting corruption.
Yeah.
That's why we must do it. We must not give up, remain optimistic, and keep pushing for change.
Yeah, possibly saying the same thing, but in a different, from a different angle. Having it fundamentally has to do with our country's development. If we want to see change and rapid change, you spoke earlier about someone traveling from Toledo to Belize City. I mean, if we spend a little extra dollar in ensuring that we get that entire system electronically, people don't have to be traveling and costing them extra.
Yeah.
And then the revenues to the government goes straight into the kitty, as opposed to this layering of costs that goes along with having to travel and having people facilitate transactions for you. So, in a nutshell, it's about our development, how quickly we develop, and everybody benefiting in the long run.
Yeah. All right.
And our individual responsibilities, we must not forget.
And we all have to keep on asking the question as well as we move into election season. You know, you can ask the person who comes around to campaign to your house, what are you going to do about corruption? We're 3 years in, and you keep on asking the question until we can get some answers that we're happy with. But thank you for coming in and giving us some of the answers so
to
far.
celebrate International Anti-Corruption Day.
All right. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back in a few. Stay tuned.